I want to acknowledge my teachers, who through my dance, through philosophy, I just embody their lineage and their teachings, and hopefully will be sharing them with you, so I acknowledge them as well before I start. So thank you all for being here. So I'm talking about continuing colonizations, and when we think of colonization, we of course think of histories of colonization, and obviously in India, our lives, our philosophies, we as people, we were profoundly affected by the hundreds of years of colonization. But that is not what I'm going to talk about now, because there is already a lot of work that's being done on what that did to our forms and philosophy. What I'm more interested in is the trajectories of colonization that continue even to our times. And these include things which I suppose we can call the neoliberal kind of market economy paradigms, paradigms of multiculturalism and democracy, and all of these things which both in India and outside of India. And this is the interesting thing, because we often think colonization is something that is done to a culture, but these trajectories, like globalization or neoliberal philosophies, they are very pervasive these days. So both in India and outside of India, they are profoundly changing the philosophy and practice of cultures. And so this is what I want to dwell a little bit on, and looking at it through the lens of my dance practice, which obviously is the way I kind of act in the world. So using that as a bit of an example or a case study to look at this. So we live in times where we call it's postmodernism, and postmodernism has really fragmented some of those very kind of monolithic ways of looking at the world. It has brought into, especially in the arts, ideas of the body and subjectivity, through French philosophers and other artists, both in Europe and elsewhere. And you'd think that this should have fragmented these kind of big paradigms by which we look at life. And I think I wouldn't be alone in saying that that is really not the case. And we do still have very dominant cultural paradigms that are quite pervasive. And I think part of the problem is because we don't have philosophies that allow for plurality, that allow for ambivalence, that allow for ambiguity, and that is the problem. So postmodernism can only take us thus far, and we are still within these frameworks of polarity. So we are not absolute, we are subjective, but that's still a polarity. And so I think for me that seems to be the limitation. And the richness is that there are philosophies that do allow for plurality and ambivalence and ambiguity, if only we can actually step outside of these dominant paradigms, and also not try to kind of pull them into the tent and then kind of reshape and reinterpret them in ways that are comfortable to us. So one of those examples is Indian philosophy. And so if I put it very simply, the fundamental quest, I suppose, maybe in any philosophy, any way of living, is what is my relationship to action? And in Indian philosophy, there is a suggested relationship, is what is called nishkarma karma, which is you act without a focus on the results, which means focus on the benefits of action. And so you don't focus on profit or loss. So your action is not governed by the question, what am I going to gain out of this action? Or what am I afraid of losing from this action? These are big questions. And they can really, if you start thinking about that when you act, they really profoundly shift things within you. And so the different systems of philosophy, I think that it's the same in Buddhism, is about how you put this core kind of concept into practice, because ultimately it is about the practice. It's called karma yoga or karma, which is that it is only through action that you change anything. So you change your feeling, your behavior, only through action. And so what is the action? And all of these traditions within India, whether it's dance or yoga or tantra or whatever it is, are action forms of this philosophy, or what are called the agama traditions. So agama means the practice aspects of the philosophy. And so they're all traditions which, in different ways, depending upon our temperaments, they allow us to practice this way of acting, which kind of posits a different relationship between our expectations from that action. So how is dance positioned within this philosophy? In the Natya Shastra, the purpose of dance, and I'm going to just read out a translation, always problematic to translate Sanskrit, but it's Natya Shastra, which is a text that is variously dated to somewhere between 500 BCE and 500 CE. It says, Natya, which is the word for dance, and I'll come to that word in a minute, is meritorious, sacred, and destructive of the word papam, which is being very wrongly translated in English as sin. But papam simply means ignorance, that is, ignorance about what is real and what is not real. So it is destructive of that ignorance. He who listens to Natya, who performs Natya and witnesses it with attention, shall attain that goal, which is the same as the goal of the Vedic scholars, which is the sannyasis, the people who renounce and who go into a spiritual path. The goals of those who perform rituals, and the goals of those who worship the deities. So that is the purpose of Natya, which is the word. And I'm going to use Natya rather than dance, because again, when we think of dance, it has a certain definition and a certain expectation, and you'll see that as I go through it, maybe the idea of Natya doesn't always match those expectations we have of dance. So dance is Natya, which combines narrative, movement, and a deeply spiritual theory called rasa, and music and costume, and a yogic kind of approach to life. So for example, in the Natya Shastra, there's a question about who should be the stewards of dance, right in the beginning of Natya Shastra, which people tend to ignore and go to the chapters that talk about the movements of the body. But right at the beginning it says, who are the people who are going to be given a stewardship of dance? And firstly it's proposed that the devas, or the gods, should have this. And then it is said, no, they're not going to have this, they don't have the temperament to be stewards of dance. It should be given to munis. And so muni is a very specific Sanskrit word, which is sort of translated into a sannyasi or somebody who renounces, but the word muni comes from the Sanskrit word maunam, which is silence. So it's the silence of the verbal language and the silence of that spoken verbal outward kind of projected language, and those are the munis, and they are the ones who were given the dance form in order to continue and to teach and to propagate it. And at the heart of Indian dance theory is rasa, which deeply roots Natya as a practice of bhakti. And so what is bhakti? Again, in English it has been inadequately translated as devotion, which is still very polarized, because I mean that is the problem with English language, is that it kind of fundamentally works in polarities. So when you say devotion, there is devotion to someone. But bhakti in India is, the heart of bhakti is what is called ananya bhakti, which is there is no anya, there is no other. So it is what you worship and you are the same thing. So it is that complete union. And so in rasa, where you have the deities which are proposed as archetypes, you are not worshipping this deity, and you're not even becoming the deity, because there is nothing else to become. So you see, so that the whole practice is about that approach. That is the rasa approach. And you have 8 or 9 rasas, depending on which text you follow. And these rasas, again, they've been translated as emotions, and that's the word I used to, because there is no other word to translate it as. But what they are is they're constellations, they're emotional constellations. And each constellation has multiple feeling attributes. It has particular colors, it has particular deities, it has particular kinds of music that go with it, particular rhythms that go with it. So it is a really complex kind of constellation or a holding space. And when you practice the rasa, it is not an experience of ordinary life. It's not ecstatic. It is not outside of yourself. It is not self-expression. It is not intuitive. It is a rasa experience. And so that is the rasa which is at the heart of Indian dance practice. And I would think of rasa as very similar to, say, the, in Yoga Shastra, in yoga you've got the eight sort of limbs of yoga, the Ashtanga aspect of yoga. And so now people think yoga means the asanas, and then you have this and then, but actually they all go together. They are not one after the other. The holding space of yoga is all of them, pranayama, yama niyamas, asana, dhyana, all of that is held together. And rasa is the same thing. So this is where I go back to what I said about the philosophy that allows for plurality of experience, ambiguity, ambivalence. So you don't need to define it, you don't need to give it name and form and labels. And so that is really the practice of rasa, is an invitation to enter into that kind of space. So where I think Natya is, probably a little bit more complicated than things like yoga, is that it relies a lot more than yoga on practice. So the Yoga Shastra, the text itself is very skeletal. You don't really get very much from the text, Yoga Shastra. That's why the practice lineages were really important. And the Natya Shastra even more profoundly so, because if you go to the Natya Shastra, it makes very little sense as a practice. But it is what is not in the text that is really important. And what is not in the text is held in the practice traditions. So my teacher was a 10th generation performer in his family. So they had a lineage of performers. We never looked at the Natya Shastra in the 15 years or so that I studied with him. I came to the Natya Shastra actually when I moved to the West, and I went to the text. And I found, well, there was really nothing new in the Natya Shastra that I didn't already know through the practice. And there was a lot more in the practice which is not in the text. And this is not something new, because I think the 10th century AD commentator on philosopher on Indian dance, Abhinava Gupta, said that the text is only a signpost, and you have to go to people who know the practice to be able to kind of get the whole practice of Natya Shastra. So what happens then when we take such a practice and put it into our times? In India, the break between the temple and the practice and the lineages in the practice has been happening for a very long time. During the colonial times, the British saw some of these practices as immoral, and they banned temple dancing. There was also, there were also Indians who bought into this view on dance, and there was a whole middle class movement in India to move it away from any sort of temple practices into more middle class contexts, into theaters. And so today, dance is as practiced as a profession as it is in the West. So consider the difference. That my teacher in his family didn't really choose dancing. It was something that was part of their role as temple priests. It was in their family, so when they were born, that's what they did. It wasn't a conscious choice of, I want to be a dancer. But whereas now, of course, it's marketed, it's put outside, there are classes, people choose, they go into the marketplace and they'll choose which teacher they want. If the teacher is not going to make them perform in 2 years, they'll flip teachers and go to somebody else who will, make them a star quickly. There are dance competitions, people pay to go and see dance. I hope you can feel how different this context is. And should it matter? I mean, why should it matter? am I just being nostalgic and wishing for, these times past? There was a time in my own career that I thought all of this was we didn't need to go and have these structures of lineage and practice and 15 years with a teacher, and I was and am a feminist, and so I questioned a lot of these things and explored different things. But I suppose where I come back to the value of this practice is, I go back to what I said in the beginning, is that they offer a different way of practicing a different relationship to life, to reality, to thinking, and I think that's really important in our times. And so hence the value of these practices, both in India and outside of India. So today in India, the very idea of a woman's body is a globalized one. So you've got, we've also been hijacked by multinationals, by advertising. So if you look at the big icons of Indian femininity as exemplified in Bollywood, they are no different to models of the West. They're tall, they're willowy, they are the faces of Western cosmetic brands and companies, and they look nothing like the Indian women on the street. Their bodies look nothing like the bodies that have been celebrated in dance and in sculpture in India for centuries. So, and many of these dancers, when I started studying contemporary dance several years ago, that was an unusual thing to do. But now, many dancers in India, they go overseas, they study classical ballet, contemporary dance, they really buy into the tropes of contemporary art, Western art and aesthetics, and so they talk about what does dance look like for a mobile generation. So these are the trends that are coming forth in the conferences in India, and there's nothing. I'm not judgmental about it. I think there's a place for all of that, but there is also, I think, a place for the practice that really connected this dance form to a philosophy and was part of those Agama traditions, and which offered a very, very different way of not just dancing, but of living itself, and where the practice was a part of the practice of a different way of living. And so I suppose what I'm inviting space for is also for that, and not to say that the other things that are happening are irrelevant or wrong. And what of Indian dance in Australia? So there was a time when I think cross-cultural work in Australia was really flourishing. I mean, again, at the risk of sounding very nostalgic, when I lived here in my first sort of phase here in the late 80s and 90s, there was a really thriving cross-cultural dance scene in Australia. I was fortunate to be among the companies. There were others like Chandrabanu in Melbourne. There were No and Bhutto dancers who had their companies, and flamenco dancers. So and these were companies that were really standing side by side with contemporary and Western, at least in dance companies, and were part of the fabric of Australian dance. And what was also important at the time was there was a real doorway into these forms being seen as equal to Western dance forms. And that is really important. And that is what plurality is about, of having equal spaces in the public domain. In the words of multicultural theorist Bhikkhu Parekh, who talks about multiculturalism as a way of creating those kind of equal spaces of engagement in the public domain. And I think that was what was really exciting, the fact that these companies were occupying the same space as other Australian dance companies. And I look back at the time to a work I did with Meryl Tankard called Rasa for the Adelaide Festival. And I think what was really powerful for me in that work was that Meryl's approach to it was also to consider the dance form that I was practicing, which is Kuchipudi. I continue to practice that, as equal to her own practice. So in the studio, there was no kind of dominant paradigm and this other paradigm. There was really a holding space where both things were interacting on an equal basis. And there are no words to describe that because it is an experience. And so I think that for me was a really seminal moment. I think that work was, I think it was probably before its time, not just in Australia, but I would say even across the world, that sort of approach to cross-cultural work. But I think since then, there's been, in my view, there's been a dismantling of that cross-cultural space, and not just in dance. And I think it has to do with the fact, again, of the fact that we do not have a paradigm that allows for plurality. We do not have a paradigm that allows for stepping into the unknown, to be ambivalent, to say, I don't know, and this is unknown, and this is ambiguous, and I don't have words for this, and can I just allow myself to experience this and trust that other ways of knowing and being might have things to offer to me. So I think that is why we struggle with holding all these different cultures in the same space. So we like to have one thing that's dominant and then all the other things under it. So what do we share between the Australian and Indian context? And I think it is a question about how do we allow for these practices? Are they valuable in our contemporary society? Do we need to make spaces for them? And what does that space look like? I was lucky to go to a talk by Clive Hamilton. Some of you may know him. He's an Australian economist, philosopher. His book, Defiant Earth, it's an amazing book, The Age of the Anthropocene, and I was lucky to be at one of his talks where he talked about the fact that we are at a time in our relationship with our life here that it's really troubling. And all of our current paradigms are not really working. They're not working. We're fiddling at the margins, but it's not working. And he was calling for a new way of relating to life, to our actions, to Earth, and that's what these philosophies have to offer. A new way, a new practice of, why do we act? A new way of taking ourselves away from the center of existence, of seeing ourselves as part of life, how radical that idea is, to see ourselves as part of life, and what will action look if we can really experience that. And all these frameworks, whether it's Tantra or yoga or whatever it is, are ways of practicing that difference in relationship, because that is an experience. It is not a thought, but it is an action, and it's an experience. And that's what these practices have to offer. So I hope that there'll be some time for you for reflections and comments, or I don't have any answers, but there might be more questions. Thank you.